So in this first chapter, um, the author of the textbook, N. Gregory Mankiw, starts to talk about the 10 principles of economics, basically the 10 core concepts that he thinks define this discipline that perhaps you're learning about for the first time. So let's start to talk about the slides. Okay. So here we've got the slides that you can now all follow as well on the slide deck, and this will be me just talking about them. So again, these are the 10 core principles or 10 key summary thoughts about what it is that economics is. Now, to add to this, basically, he organizes this, the author of the textbook organizes this into 3 parts. First, how people make decisions. Right, so one of the key things about economics as a general discipline is that it helps us think about how people make decisions. And a lot of this ends up being concepts that are largely microeconomic. I should probably spell it out the first time here. Generally microeconomics. That would be if you had taken Econ 130 already. This is going to be part of it. How people interact with one another, which is also kind of a microeconomic aspect. And then also how the economy as a whole works, which is obviously at that, I shouldn't say obviously because it's not obvious, but that would be more macroeconomics, which is the focus of this course, Econ 131. So out of these 3 big ideas, this is how then Mankiw organizes his 10 concepts. Those 10 concepts being one, that people do face trade-offs. We have to make decisions. 2, that the true cost of something isn't necessarily the monetary cost, but it's rather what you give up, what you could have done instead. That people make decisions at the margin. And we're going to see that what that means is that people think about what they're going to do only in terms of the next thing. So the marginal benefit would be the benefit to doing something one more time. The marginal cost being the cost to doing something one more time. And finally, in this part, that people do respond to incentives. Meaning people, if you encourage them to do something, they will act that way. Then in terms of how people interact, that trade benefits everyone. Then that markets are generally speaking good. but that also sometimes there's a role for the government. And then finally, for the macroeconomic, now there's some macroeconomic aspects and how people interact. But then when we get truly to the macroeconomic specific things, that the standard of living depends on the country's production capabilities, that prices rise when more money is printed. These are all things that we're going to be not only talking about more in this chapter, but also we're going to be talking about it throughout the entire semester. I'm trying to giving you a roadmap here to what we're doing in this chapter, if only because, this isn't a murder mystery. I don't want you to be guessing at how this is all organized. The way that this chapter is going to be organized is it's going to deal with each of these three questions here: how people make decisions, how people interact, how the economy as a whole works, and then we're going to talk about each of these 10, with the 10th one being that there is a short run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay. Let's go back to this. So, before we get to that point here, let's start to then talk about how people make decisions. That making of decisions comes from this general concept of what economics is. Economics is originally a Greek word, oikonomos. I don't know any Greek, but oikonomos was really about talking about managing the household. And so for the ancient Greeks, the household was really the economy. It was where production occurred, it's where consumption occurred. And so someone had to manage that production and consumption within the household. That person managing it was engaged in economic decisions, according to the Greeks, or oikonomos. So again, those households did face these decisions, as we all do, even in our own households, right? How do we allocate our time? Who's going to have the childcare duties? Who's going to be doing the work? How do we decide what to consume? How do we manage our budget? And so, writ large, meaning for societies as a whole, these same decisions have to be faced. So even though I don't engage in production at the home, right, I do decide how many hours I'm going to work. And even my wife and I decide who's going to do the work. Well, in our case, we both have a job. Neither of us is independently wealthy. So what is true in for economics as a discipline to exist, you need to have scarcity. There needs to be some sort of limit, that we have more wishes and desires and that we have more needs than we have resources. So this is key. If you don't have scarcity, you don't really have economics. Because economics is all about making the decisions to manage that scarcity. If there's nothing to manage, then there is no economics, which then gives us our big definition here. How society manages its scarce resources is the definition of economics. Now, these are the three things I already have talked about. there are three things that of where economists act in the economy. That would be, again, how people make decisions, how people interact, and how that all works in the economy as a whole. So again, these 10 concepts are all going to be under these three categories. So let's talk then about, let's just review here. These are the four that in terms of people making decisions, people face trade-offs. The cost is something, is what you give up to get it. Rational people think at the margin, and that people respond to incentives. I don't disagree with a single one of these. These are in fact true. To disagree with these then starts to lead you away, at least from what economics as a formal discipline deals with. Let's talk about each of these principles. We'll actually get to them here. Let me. The second one being how people interact. Again, these are our three principles I've already talked about. Trade makes everyone better off. That you might disagree in hearing it that way, but I'll explain why that's the case. Markets are, generally speaking, a good way to organize economic activity, and governments can sometimes improve the market outcomes. Standard of living depends on ability to produce the goods. Prices rise when too much money is printed. Short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay, let's get to the first one here. A very common phrase among economists is that there's no such thing as a free lunch, which always causes an incredibly bad joke whenever economists go out to eat with each other. Someone inevitably says this line, but it is in fact true, right? If someone's giving you something, they must want something. And even if my good friend, let's say, says to me, hey, Scheiding, let's go out to eat. But let's say I don't, and let's say even the person buys my meal, they pay for my parking, let me order whatever I want. It still cost me something. I still had to give something up. I gave up my time, right? So even if something is free, there's still a cost. Nothing is free. Now, you could also have had to pay for that meal. So then the cost would have been the price you paid for that meal plus the cost of what you could have been doing instead. What the thing was that you gave up to do that, right? Like for me, given my family, I would rather sleep. If I was ever given an extra hour, I would rather sleep. So when someone wants to have a meeting with me for an hour, it's not costless to me. I think about that extra hour I could have had of sleep, or that extra hour I could have had with my kids, or that extra hour I could have had with my wife. There's always some sort of trade-off in that way. Alternatively, right, if I spend an extra hour with my friends, that means I'm giving up spending time with my family. If I spend too much time with my family, I'm giving up time spending with my friends. So these are all kinds of things, which again means that when you make a decision from an economic perspective, you need to think about what the trade-off is, what you could have been doing instead. Sorry. What you could have done instead. That is me trying to draw an E. Really doesn't want to do it there instead. Those, again, trade-offs are helping us allocate our time, distribute our time. We face this both as individuals, and we face it even as a society. If you think about what politicians debate about, right, they're often, the classic one is this guns and butter idea, this idea of back in the 1950s of, were we going to spend more money on national defense, or were we going to build schools or something like that? And in fact, there's this like famous speech by President Eisenhower of him talking about the fact that we build all these weapons. Building more weapons means that we have fewer bricks for school buildings, et cetera, et cetera. Another trade-off would be a clean environment or a high level of income. And we also then just generally face this trade-off between being efficient and being equitable. And it's, if you were going to give everyone something and you're going to try to have equality, then people face less of an incentive to do hard work. And that'd even be things, right, we could think about in terms of like unemployment insurance, even like the welfare system, although it's kind of a antiquated word that he's using, that Mankiw is using there. But generally speaking, to the extent that we try to get more equality, we have less efficiency. And so there needs to be some sort of balance. You don't want the society to be ultra efficient and that everyone's kind of on their own in a Darwinian sense, right? Like survival of the fittest. On the other hand, you don't want to give just everyone all the same thing because then no one faces an incentive to work hard. We need to balance it in some way. Now, what is the cost of that trade-off, right? So the first principle is that there are trade-offs. What is that trade-off? As I said, it's what you could have done instead. That what you could have done instead has a name. It's called the opportunity cost. So that is the formal economic definition of the trade-off. The trade-off is the opportunity cost, what I could have done instead. It's not only that, but it's also the highest valued thing. So let's again say that my friend, again, takes me to lunch, is going to pay for my meal, is going to drive me there, and all I have to do is talk to the person for an hour. Again, no such thing as free lunch. That lunch meal is not free to me. I could have been doing something else instead. Now, let's think of all the things I could have been doing instead. I could have, my wife tells me I don't know enough about popular culture, right? Like I still call I still call it the pound sign, that thing with Twitter. I still call it a pound sign. Apparently it has a different name. Okay, you know what? Like I could spend some time learning about stuff like that. I don't know anything about Disney movies. Despite having kids, like I still don't know I've seen some of the movies because my kids watched that Disney Plus thing, but like I could tell you a very general thing about some of the movies, but not very much. Like that one where like the cat's dad dies. It's like one where like the cat's like a little kitten and his dad dies and then he has to like run things. Again, I don't know anything. That's about all I know. I haven't even seen he's got like some enemy. It's like a pig or something. Anyway, I could spend the hour learning all about that movie, right? And I could sound a lot less dumb than I'm sounding right now. Or I could sleep an extra hour, or I could do some research. I could make this lecture. So there's a whole number of things I could do instead during that hour that I have to talk to my friend at lunch. The opportunity cost is the most highly valued thing among all of those things. How you value that's going to be kind of unique to the individual, right? So if I'm feeling incredibly self-conscious about my lack of knowledge about Disney movies, then I probably should study up on like a Disney movie a day, right? And I'll start to become an expert on it. Or let's just say I don't spend any time with my kids, then I should probably spend an hour with my kids, right? Or if I'm really behind in making these lectures, I should make that lecture instead, right? So it's the most highly valued thing is that opportunity cost. That is the trade-off. And then when my friend says, hey, Scheiding, let's go to lunch, I'll buy your lunch and I'll drive you there, I shouldn't be focused on the fact that it's free. I should be saying, okay, what are all these things I could be doing? Is this the thing I want to do? Do I want to go to lunch and talk to this person for an hour? Or do I want to catch up on what Disney movies are? That's going to be how I make that decision. And that value I give to learning about Disney movies is unique to me, because I'm sure there's someone that's listening to this lecture right now who thinks, how did this guy even get a job? He doesn't even know the name of the cat movie. Like, dude, seriously, like, I totally agree with you, but it's not my, we all have blind spots, right? And that's my blind spot. I don't know anything about those kinds of things. Now, the third principle is that rational people make decisions at the margin, meaning when we say at the margin, we mean doing something one more time. So if I do something one more time, I should compare the costs and the benefits to doing so, and that this is what rational people do. Now, I can't, as a discipline, as an economist, I can't deal with people who do not think at the margin, right? They have to think about making adjustments based on what happens when people do thing one more time. So in some sense, this is why like addictions or like hoarding are difficult for economists to understand, because, right, if the person has 50 empty printer cartridges in their house, that seems odd. That seems, I don't want to say, right. I mean, if we were talking about it like, as friends, I might say, that's crazy. Right now, again, you wouldn't want to use the word crazy, but it does seem quite odd enough that I know that there's TV shows about that kind of thing. But another way to say it would be is that that person is irrational. And the reason why I know that they're irrational is because maybe you could understand the person having one empty printer cartridge in their house, right? Because maybe you want to have like a backup just in case yours dies, that you could take it to like Costco, get it filled up with ink, and then, right, you've got like a spare always sitting around. But to have 50, why would you ever need 50 printer cartridges? Clearly, when that person collected the 50th, right? So if we're talking about the person is 49 and they're collecting the 50th empty printer cartridge, and they thought about what's the benefit of having the 50th cartridge versus the cost of now storing the 50th cartridge, we would say that that person did not think at the margin or make an adjustment. If they just got the 50th cartridge because that's what they do, then that person is irrational, because there's no way that the benefit of having a 50th backup printer cartridge could compensate for the cost of now storing a 50th cartridge. That's what we mean by people, rational people thinking at the margins, giving us a central rule. I don't know, is that person, I guess that person's a college student, and looking pretty happy talking about something and carrying big physical textbooks. Okay, anyway, if you're considering getting a tattoo for this course, this would be a great thing to get a tattoo of. That when you decide to do something, it must be because the marginal benefits, the benefit to doing it one more time, exceed the costs to doing it one more time. This is like, this is like an eating contest, right? So I used to do this thing where I would eat the number of pieces of sushi as I am years of age. I just turned 43. So I started this practice at about age 16. And first 10 years, it was pretty great. Like I would like not eat anything for the day beforehand, right? And then I would just buy a big party platter of sushi. And then I would sit in the parking lot and eat them all, right? And one by one. And I would have this like 2 liter of Sprite, and I would just be drinking Sprite and eating spicy tuna sushi, one after the other after the other. Now, again, in those early years, you could kind of eat them, and then sort of towards the end, your stomach's kind of hurting, right? Well, now at 43, it's become almost impossible at this point. So in fact, for my 43rd, now I've decided to start subtracting. So to eat 42 pieces of sushi, which is what I did this year, dude, by the end, you're like almost having like, you're almost like throwing up, right? Like that is irrational, right? The marginal benefits do not exceed the marginal costs, right? It's gluttonous what I'm doing. I'm doing it only because I have this weird, insane rule in my mind that says eat number of pieces of sushi as I am years of age. It's irrational what I am doing. Now, I am sure there are inevitably other things I do that are irrational, but why, how I would understand or describe to you that what I do is irrational is that when I consume that, let's say, 35th piece of sushi, my stomach hurts and my stomach is already full. So I'm not getting any benefit. There's no benefit to eating the 35th. Notice there, I'm focusing on not 35 total, but the 35th piece of sushi. So I've eaten 34, let's say, and at 34, I'm no longer hungry and all is well. Stomach is fine. I'm good to go. But eating the 35th one, I start to like dry heave and like, I just don't want to eat. Like, I think I'm just going to like, like I'm going to collapse, right? I've eaten too many. There is no benefit to doing what I'm going to do. And in fact, there are costs to doing it, right? And we can say this even with, more PG-13 rated items, right? We could talk about like, there's this like, I'm sure this shows my age, but like I used to love watching the cartoon TV show King of the Hill, and there's this like episode where Bobby Hill, he's like the little kid, he's like age 13 or 14, and he starts like smoking cigarettes, and Hank Hill's this like uber man kind of guy, and he's like, he doesn't want his son to be smoking cigarettes. So what he does to stop him from smoking cigarettes at age 13 or 14 is he buys him like a carton of cigarettes and he smokes them all. And it's kind of smart, right? Because then he smokes all these cigarettes and then he like his face turns blue and he gets like really sick. Well, that's probably going to stop him from doing that again. And that's actually what it ends up doing in the episode. Not that I'm advocating that that's the way to stop smoking cigarettes, but there's a lot of things you can think about in your personal life where you've stopped doing it because you had a bad experience where the cost exceeded the benefits. Now, there's this concept in economics called the diamond water paradox. So let's think about this. Why is water so cheap while diamonds are so expensive? Well, part of it is that water is needed to survive, while diamonds are clearly not a necessity, right? They're just a luxury. So now let's talk about the benefits of buying these things. And part of it's going to depend on how many of these things I already have. So if we're talking about water, right? I've already got tons of water, right? I can turn on the faucet and gallons and gallons and gallons and gallons come out of the faucet. I am never, at least in my case, I'm never in need of water. So the benefit, the marginal benefit, the additional benefit to a gallon of water is very low because I have lots of clean water around me. Diamonds are different, right? I personally do not own a diamond at all. I bought my wife an engagement ring, a wedding ring, and I bought her a ring every time we had a child. So I bought a few diamonds in my life for my wife. But even now, with my third child on the way, I'm not sure if we have children after number 3, if I'm going to even buy a diamond ring anymore. Because I don't know, she's got a lot of diamonds already, and she might say even the same thing. And so if we look at the benefit in terms of diamonds, if you own no diamonds and you really like that kind of thing, then you might be willing to pay quite a bit for a diamond because you don't have any and you just like that kind of thing. But if I were to like give you an entire diamond mine, diamonds aren't going to be that important to you anymore because you have so many. Now, let's talk about the last principle within this, how people make decisions um, category, and that's incentive. I certainly structured this course around this, is that people do things when you encourage them to do it, provide them an incentive, right? So if we think about things, why are hybrid cars being made? It's not because Toyota cares about keeping the environment clean. No, it's because they can charge more for a hybrid car, right? Or Tesla can charge more for an electric car. And so it encourages a company to do the right thing. But also we can think about it in terms of like, let me give you two little examples here. In Hawaii, on our taxes, you may have noticed, you can get a $25 tax credit for buying a car seat for your car. Well, that's an incentive, right? Not that that makes the difference for me for buying a car seat or not, but you could think about if I'm trying to manage my budget, I might be like, let's let my kids sit in the back seat. I'll put a seatbelt on them. They don't need a car seat. But what if on my tax forms, I could make a car seat $25 cheaper by providing a tax incentive to buy that car seat? Well, maybe I would do it. And so then there's a reason why the tax structure is set up the way it is. Or there's always this thing like in the tax code as well, where like you can get in the state, there's an incentive for having like a, what's it called, like an extraordinary tree or something, or a special tree. Well, it encourages someone to not cut down a special tree, or it encourages someone to install solar panels, or the tax code encourages someone to adopt a child. All things that we think as a society are good that people do, and then we provide them incentive to do it. And so then we have these other things too, right? We can also disincentivize people to do certain things. So one example here would be like seatbelts, right? That seatbelts save lives. And so it's not just enough to say that seatbelts save lives, but you would also need to say something like it's against the law to do so. But even if you encourage people to do this and you incentivize them to wear their seatbelt because then you're following the law and you're not going to get a ticket. On the other hand, it can cause, sometimes there's unintended consequences. So as this last point brings out here, is that people might also then drive more recklessly and faster and wear their seatbelt, but still die because they're going to behave more recklessly. And perhaps by driving more recklessly, they could kill those around them, their passengers who might not be wearing their seatbelt or other pedestrians. Okay, now let's talk about the second part, how people interact. So already at this point now, we've done how people make decisions. We've done that part. So now we're dealing with the second part, how people interact. And how people interact, there are 3 principles under this. So let's start first with principle 5. There's this general belief that economists have, and that general belief is that free trade benefits all. Ooh, there's a joke here. For $5 a week, you can watch baseball without getting nagged to cut the grass. I don't get it. It's really not a funny joke. That's really not a funny joke, and it's from the Wall Street Journal. And generally, I like Wall Street Journal jokes, but that's not really a funny joke. Free trade benefits all. Free trade benefits all. Absolutely 100%. If the trade is mutually agreeable, meaning every party agrees to the trade, you have to have been made better off. So so I say this because as we're going to learn in next week of the lectures, I don't understand as an economist, and I think it'd be incredibly hard pressed to find a legitimate economist that would advocate for stopping or restricting trade between countries, for at least economic reasons. Now, I say that knowing full well that because we have allowed shoes to be made in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and other East Asian countries, the net result of that is that, right? Like, what is it? Like, there's like that one particular sub brand of like New Balance shoes and like, one or two other pairs of shoes. Uh, we basically do not make shoes anymore. If you are a shoemaker in the United States, free trade has clearly not benefited you, but it has benefited society as a whole. In fact, shoe prices are incredibly cheap, right? Like you can go to Walmart and find the cheapest pair of shoes. I bet you if you found like the cheapest pair of shoes, you could probably get something like in the clearance area at Walmart for like $15 for a pair of shoes or $10 for a pair of shoes. Now, again, they're not going to be great quality, but they're going to be darn cheap. And what that means is that everyone can afford shoes. Like you'd be hard pressed to find someone who says, I cannot afford shoes. Now, the problem is, again, the shoemaker has lost his or her job. So that little subpart of society has lost out from free trade. But we can do something as a society to help that person so that free trade can still occur, which is in fact what we do. So we have this program called TAA, which stands for Trade Adjustment Assistance. So before moving to Hawaii, I was born in Wisconsin. My wife is from Hawaii. So I used to teach at the University of Wisconsin, and I would regularly have in class this like grizzly old man in each and every class. And I talked to this one, and this one guy used to make like, like on like a speedboat or like a regular boat, that you like, you take out on the water. He used to make those engines that you put on the back of a boat. And the job had moved from Wisconsin to India. So now these motors were being made in India at a far cheaper cost. And it was because of free trade. Now, what do you do to stop that grizzly old man from getting really grumpy? Well, because of trade adjustment assistance, which is a federal program, he was given something like 2 years of unemployment, right? Which is like 4 times what he would normally be offered. Normal unemployment is like 26 weeks. He was instead given 2 years of unemployment insurance, and he was given free health care, and he could take classes for free. Like it was enough to get this grizzly old man to say, okay, you know what? I still want to work 10 or 15 years. This job doesn't exist anymore in the United States. And then he was retraining to basically install solar panels. And he had to get like an associate's degree. So he was taking like intro econ, kind of like this class. Right. And so the government was paying for him to take the class. He was getting health care and he was getting enough money to live on. And he was okay with it because he knew he needed to do something better. But also, societies as a whole benefited from free trade existing because when there is free trade, there is specialization. Meaning that in India, then they can become in that country really good at making some industrial items, right? So then they could try to centralize the making of all these outboard motors for boats, right? Or light machinery. They could do that in India, right? Or in the case of shoes, they can make shoes cheaply in Indonesia. And so Indonesians can focus on shoes, We in the United States can focus on, I don't know, really good at law. We have lots of good legal services. We can focus on legal services. And so as a result, right, Indonesians give us shoes, we give them lawyers and legal services, or we give them electronics, or we give them whatever, right? Movies, right? We do make a lot of movies. We give them media, they give us shoes. Everyone benefits. So we're good at making movies because we make a lot of them, and we have good actors. Indonesians are good at making shoes because they make lots of shoes. So there's specialization and then mutually agreeable trade. Principle number 6 is that generally speaking, and I firmly believe this, is that generally speaking, markets are a really good way of organizing economic activity. There are 3 questions that every economy must answer. And that would be these 3 questions. What is going to be produced? How much is going to be produced? Who is it going to be produced for? In our economy, those questions, these 3 important questions, are all answered by us, the consumers. We decide what is produced. As an extreme example, right? Like I like those almonds that have like soy sauce and wasabi. I really like those. Now, as a result, right, there's enough people like me that the almond makers know that there's enough people like me that they're going to make them, right? And they're going to charge a certain price for them that I'm going to be willing to pay. And then I get the item. And it wasn't like the almond maker said, everyone must eat wasabi and soy sauce almonds. Not at all, right? That flavor was made because us as consumers, it was determined, wanted it. So they don't make flavors that no one wants, because then the items would go unsold. And then the company would realize, dude, no one wants our, I gotta think of something, a flavor that no one wants. No one wants our, I don't know, I can't even think of different flavors. No one wants almonds that taste like moldy water, right? Because it's a bad flavor. And so, that's just not made, right? So there are weird flavors that are made, might seem like weird to you or I, but there's obviously enough people that like that flavor that they're buying it. And what's nice about a market is that no one is like heavy-handed about this. No one is like telling us what to consume or what not to consume. No one is saying what the price has to be or shouldn't be. And I don't have to feel like it's unfair when it's decided who gets the item. So thinking about this a different way, right? We can think about products that are banned. Let's just take the one example of fireworks, right? Fireworks, you have to get like a permit or whatever, but you can't just go and get like big, super huge fireworks. In general, as a market activity, it's anti-market, right? I mean, there's some people that obviously get great joy out of setting off fireworks. And there are people like me who really don't care either way. And then there's obviously some people who are incredibly negatively affected by it, right? Like, they have PTSD, or, they have little pets or whatever. They like their sleep and they don't like being interrupted by the sound of fireworks. We as a society have decided that you cannot set off fireworks, right? Or only with a special permit. It doesn't work well. It doesn't work well for society, because then that means that some people are now denied being able to enjoy setting off fireworks. Just like right? What if we say here in Hawaii, you have to be at least 21 to buy cigarettes, or at least 21 to drink. Well, do we think that, honestly, that a person who's 20 is so immature that they can't do that same thing? And I certainly know enough really dumb 40-year-olds who shouldn't be drinking or smoking. Um, so there's a problem, right? For me personally, when I see these kinds of things, and we can make examples, we can provide better explanations for why those regulations exist, but it's hard to justify why you have to be 21 before you can, um, you know, buy liquor or buy tobacco, or why do you have to have a medical excuse, let's say, to buy, marijuana, or why do I have to get a permit to set off a firework, or right, like why do I have to do these things? Why is the government imposing a restriction? There can be very good reasons for all those things I just identified, but the problem is that you're going to create inefficiencies. And so that's why in principle 6 is that markets are, generally speaking, the best way to organize economic activity. And that's why markets are generally used. There are no restrictions in the market for buying gasoline. I can buy as little or as much gasoline as I want. I can buy as many or as few dressers as I want. I can buy as many or as few computers as I want. I can buy as many or as few cell phones as I want, right? Most things have no restrictions. And so people buy the number that makes rational sense to them, answering these 3 questions. And what's, again, cool about this, cool for me as an economist, is that prices are driving everything. How we know how many dressers to make or how many phones to make is all dictated by the price of the item. Prices are incredibly important. Without prices, markets collapse, because then we have no way of knowing how much or how little of something to have. And in a market economy, we don't have to look out for each other. We really don't. We do what makes best sense for us. In each of us doing what makes best sense for us, the net result is that the economy as a whole benefits, as we just do the thing that benefits us each individually, where we're guided by pricing decisions, right? So some people, right, prices decide what we get. So for instance, I bought a house not too long ago. I live in Manoa. No, it's a pretty expensive place to live here on the islands, right? Now, we say it's expensive, but again, the price dictated how big of a house we bought, where specifically in Manoa we bought a house. Prices dictated that. And so when you go on those like real estate websites, right, or Zillow or realtor.com or whatever, you're looking at the price, and the price is deciding, okay, well, in my case, all my kids are in the same room. Yeah, kids, they don't care anyway, right? But they get to all be in the same room. But the kids are not in the same room as the parents, right? So I have enough money to give my kids their own room, but I only have so much money each kid gets their own room. So somehow I made a decision that made best sense for my internal budget. And the prices dictated that I didn't get too big of a house or too little of a house, right? Because if I can't afford to live in Manoa, but I have to have a house, move west, son, right? Like, keep moving west and get all the way out west to, the leeward side if I can't afford anything in town. And then if I can't afford anything in Hawaii, well, then I guess, move to the mainland, I guess, right? But those kinds of decisions are going to be driven by prices. And those prices are what Adam Smith, the famous economist here, born on my birthday, June the 5th, a Gemini like myself. Adam Smith in 1776, which is also the founding of our country, he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, which is kind of considered the economics textbook, the first economics textbook. And Adam Smith talked about this invisible hand existing. And what he described it as is that in a free market, that free market should exist because each individual is guided by prices to make the right decisions. And all that the government does is it prevents people from being guided by prices. So, for instance, if the government intervenes, this is an incredibly extreme example, so I do not want you to think that I believe this personally, but I just want to use this as an extreme example, is that everyone in, I think in the United States, everyone has access to the mail service, so we can all get the US mail. But does that make, right? So it costs me the same price to send a letter to my neighbor versus sending my letter to someone in Maine. Even though you would think that the price should be something different because it obviously costs something different to deliver a letter all the way to Maine versus just to my neighbor. So because of that, right? So because the prices don't really reflect these kinds of things, in some sense, we almost have too much mail, right? Because if it was more distance-based and more like, even like based on like the content of the thing that I wrote in the letter, if they had different prices, that might cause me to send the appropriate number of letters. You know, my wife, again, I love my wife, but we send like Christmas cards to like everybody. And she does this, like, you know, like she's probably sends like 200 Christmas cards. I think it's crazy. I think it's irrational. I think that the benefits are far lower than the costs. But for her, it's different. But what I almost am arguing is that the costs are not appropriate, are not being correctly measured, because the government in some sense is intervening and it runs the post office, and it has said that the price of a first class stamp is the same no matter where in the United States you're sending the letter. And so it makes the cost artificially lower. And so my wife is seeing this lower price, and it causes her to send, in my opinion, too many letters. And that's what happens when in some sense, in many markets, when the government intervenes to subsidize something, is that people might buy too much of that thing. I'm not gonna, if you want to think about this case study, you can, but you know, in general, this case study is one of, you know, it used to cost a great deal to use a taxi, right? The cab, right? It used to cost a lot to use the cab. For to the cab, right? It used to cost a lot to do it because that was the primary way to get around. If you didn't own a car, didn't want to take the bus, you would take the cab. But the cab's business has been decimated by the fact that Uber is much, much cheaper. Now, the reason why the cab was more expensive was because their prices were regulated by the government. Uber is not regulated by the government. And so because Uber is cheaper, it hurts that government regulated business of the cab. Just like Airbnb, unregulated hotels are, right? I have certain regulations that they need to meet, certain standards that they have to meet. And they have to pay certain taxes, whereas Airbnb does not. And so it hurts the hotels when Airbnb exists. It hurts the cab when Uber exists. And so the government carved out these things. And then when the free market intervened and had Airbnb and Uber, then we found that there were too many Ubers and that there's too many Airbnbs. And it's because the government has now lost some of that regulatory control and the prices have fallen, meaning that people consume them more. Now, on the other hand, we might think that there are some benefits to having Uber exist, in that fewer people need to have cars, and you know, it can reduce the environmental impact. But there's certainly costs as well. I don't want to focus too much on this. It's not really the primary concept here. But now this last part in how people interact is that I don't want you to think this means that economists don't think that markets should always exist for everything. We do need the government to exist. We need the government to exist to create rules, to decide on those rules, to enforce property rights, to provide certain services like the fire department and the defense. And we also have equality goals, right? So here in Hawaii, we're very fortunate. We've had um, a healthcare law since if I'm not mistaken, 1974, that makes it so that anyone who's working slightly greater than part-time has had healthcare from their employer, subsidized by their employer, since the 1970s, whereas in the mainland they have not. And the healthcare we have here in Hawaii is much better than that on the mainland. And so, because the government intervenes, we have the lowest uninsured rate in the United States here in Hawaii. And the result is hopefully that means that if most people are insured, that the health outcomes are greater, meaning we are healthier as a population in Hawaii because we all have, or most of us have, healthcare insurance. And so there can be a role for government to improve market outcomes. And again, the government could intervene to ensure that the property rights are exercised properly, but also, again, the government can intervene when there are other market failures, if people would use something too much. So the government, for instance, runs the parks because we want to have everyone to have access to the parks. But we don't want people like using the park too much that it stops others from using the park. And we want the government to exist to control the height of buildings. And we want the government to exist to build sidewalks because everyone benefits from having sidewalks and schools and parks. So we have the University of Hawaii because we think if the private sector were allowed to have universities, higher education, universities would cost too much. So the result is that, for instance, for us, our tuition, your tuition, is only about half of what it costs to run the university. The state government provides the other half. So taxpayers are subsidizing about half of your cost of going to school, and you're paying the other half. And we do that because we want you to get a higher education. Because those of you who get a higher education, it has been found, are less likely to be unemployed. You're more likely to get a better paying job. You're less likely to engage in crime. There's lots of good reasons why we want you to get a higher education. So we're willing to incentivize, to subsidize you to do that. And we're going to do that by creating the University of Hawaii, a government-sponsored organization that you pay part of it for, but we also, as a society, subsidize it. Now that's a positive externality, higher education. There are also negative externalities. So a negative externality would be something like the fact that my car pollutes. It imposes a cost on others. So I'm given a tax by the government that's based on the weight of my car, which is in some sense reflective of what's the environmental impact of my car. And I pay gasoline taxes. I pay other taxes that go along with owning a car, so that I don't just buy like 15 different cars. I have one car and it's a Prius. So it's pretty fuel efficient. It's pretty light. I still pay a pretty high set of taxes, but it makes sure that I don't buy something more than what I really need. And so the other reason, again, why the government would get involved is just to make sure that there's some semblance of equal distribution of opportunity. So we certainly have private elementary schools and private high schools, but we also have pretty good public options as well. And so we want everyone to have at least a 12th grade education. We want everyone to have access to affordable housing. We want people to have access to safety from like the police system and the fire system, and that doesn't just go to rich people. So we try to reduce inequality as best we can. Now, in this last part, we talk about how the economy as a whole works. And so one of the things that we're going to learn about here in this course in macroeconomics is that the general standard of living within the country, or as we're going to learn in this course, the gross domestic product is based on its ability to produce goods and services. Those countries that have a higher standard of living are able to produce more goods and services. So the United States, at least according to this number from 2014, has a pretty high standard of living, but it's partly because we're a very big country with a lot of people that can produce a lot of goods and services. Our ability to produce these goods and services determine how prosperous we are as a country. But what also is determining our general levels of income is how productive we all are. The measure of productivity is how much I produce in an hour, let's say. So because of technology, for instance, I can become a very productive worker. Right now I'm making this lecture on my iPad with my Apple Pencil, and I'm going to upload it to YouTube, and I'm going to have created for many students, tens and tens of students, maybe up to 100 students, I will have created this 1-hour lecture, even though we're not all in the same room, right? Even though you're all at your individual households. And so I can carry out this course and spread the knowledge incredibly wide because I have technology making me more productive. And because of that, I then earn a higher income, and we as a country are prosperous. So generally speaking, productivity is helped by having technology and by having an education. Oh, another joke. Well, it may have been 68 cents when you got in line, but it's 74 cents now. It's really dumb too. Okay, well, as we're going to learn later in the semester, generally speaking, that the solution to like the government having a very large debt is not just for the government to print more money. Generally speaking, printing more money causes inflation, and inflation is generally a bad thing. And we're going to learn why that's the case. But in general, printing more money leads to higher prices. These are all things that economists believe in. And then the 10th and final principle is that there isn't a trade-off, at least in the short run, between inflation and unemployment. You can either have high inflation and low unemployment, or high unemployment and low inflation. One or the other of those must exist in the short run. There is this trade-off. And we'll learn more about why that's the case. But it's incredibly difficult to have both low inflation and low unemployment in the short run. It's also incredibly difficult, thankfully, to have high inflation and high unemployment in the short run. And a lot of this is driven just by the business cycle in general, but we're going to talk more about this. So these are the 10 principles, as I already had outlined them already here. So this is nice and typed up. This is me having talked about it. Okay, so that finishes our lecture here for chapter 1. I'll stop the lecture here.